Hey everybody, welcome to another Driven Hunter podcast brought to you by Matthews Mission Crossbows. Today we are joined with one of my special friends and guest, Tom Indrebo from Bluff Country Outfitters. Tom and I go way, way back, and we got a lot of old history we can talk about, and you can tell probably some Pat stories. But we're going to have fun. I'm going to pick Tom's brain a lot today about what he knows about whitetail deer. And if I could, pick any guest in the entire world to join us and talk about whitetail deer and be an authority, it would be this guy right here. So we appreciate you coming over here from all the way from Wisconsin, Tom, joining us today.
My pleasure. Good old times.
We're going to get started by giving some people a little bit of history lesson on how we became friends way back in the day and how, things actually has transpired. I owe this man a lot of credit because I would not be where I am today and have a TV show and just be in the outdoor hunting industry the way I am without his help and his guidance. I mean, he's really helped me launch my career back in the day, and you'll learn some of that as we go along, but he also taught me a lot about whitetail deer. So hopefully today we can help you guys learn a little bit more. And I learn every day from him. He's like going out and learning from a deer, and the amazing part is Tom is, you're 74 now? Yeah. 74. And he is still climbing up in trees, climbing up and down these bluffs, easier than a young guy can. So still at it, running a very successful outfitting operation over in Buffalo County, Wisconsin, right across the river here. And we go way back. So how did we even actually meet? That was way back in the day. Probably the early 90s, I would say.
I think I saw a picture in Elba at Moore Brothers of a buck you filmed in Whitewater. It was called Garth.
Oh, yeah.
And that's when I first heard Pat's name. And
you should have ran that at that point, Tom.
Yeah. You're right there. Anyway, I think we met at a deer show or something finally. And then we just started hanging out and doing the fun things together, chasing deer, filming deer, shining deer. And I remember when you told me,
it was love. It was like love at first sight. I was like, "Hey, I've heard of you," and you're saying, "I've heard of you as well." And we're like, "Hey, let's get together and start dating." So, I remember that. It was at the Eau Claire Deer Classic, I believe.
Yep.
And back then, and we're like, I think we went shed hunting that first year. I came over to your place in Wisconsin.
Well, we both had the same interests, and it just parlayed from there. It took off.
That was, time flies, right?
It sure does.
Boy, so, to kind of spin the story ahead a little bit, after, we started hanging around together and going shed hunting, and I remember just, going to places that you hunted and seeing your place and stuff over there. And, years later, as we became friends, I'll never forget the time when you called me up and said, "Hey, Pat, what are you doing tonight or tomorrow and tonight?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't know. Why?" And he said, "Well, if you're not busy tonight, come on over to my house," which, was an hour or so from here. And you didn't live where you live now, but so I came over to your house in Strum, Wisconsin, and it was in the middle of winter, dead of winter, cold as all get out. Yeah. And I said, "Well, what you got? What's your thoughts?" And you're like, I want to start an outfitting business. And, I want to hear your thoughts. And, we sat down that night with a couple beers and
sat there all night. And I figured it out, came up with a name. And, and the rest is history. It took off from there.
Right. That night was, a huge, we look back and we laugh about it because you came up with the name of your outfitting business that night, brainstorming, and then we developed your first brochure that had, you know, the images, some of them which I took, you know, that were in this region, and called it Bluff Country Outfitters.
Yep.
And it's still going strong. Amazing.
It was fun. I mean, the whole trip has been fun, and the things that came into it, they never realized. You know, I thought, how can I do this? I'm having trouble shooting a Pope and Young buck myself. How am I going to get hunters on one? You know, but a lot of things happened that came into the picture that I didn't realize would. And one thing was having a lot of the hunters start coming and having hunters in the woods. But before that, I mean, the business kind of took off. We had been filming deer, and I think that's what we both started doing, and that's how we tied up too, because we were both out trying to film the biggest bucks we could every year. So as it took off there, the first year I think that we started, I got a call from Jackie Bushman, and he wanted to come hunting, and that was back in the infancy days of television, and he was on TNN, and it was one of the only hunting shows.
Yeah, I think it was one of the first ones
at that time.
Right, Buckmasters.
Yeah, and we had put a tape together, kind of our year of hunting, when he came and hunted on his show, and he held that up, it was amazing me. The phone started ringing, and it didn't stop ringing for a week straight. It was 12 hours a day that was ringing. So I really saw the power of national attention or advertising at that point, where that kind of kick-started the whole thing, where people got to know about us and stuff and started coming, and I guess the rest is history from there. Pat went to work, come over there and started guiding with me, and he was taking hunters out, and we didn't have any equipment much at the time or anything.
Right, yeah, we'll get into that here in a couple minutes, but I mean, wow, you had a vision, and I mean, I totally give you credit for not just executing it, but just killing it. And you knew enough that to get the right people there, to give you the marketing, and to expose the quality of service that you had and the quality of hunting opportunities that existed, you know, in your area and on your farms. And it just mushroomed from there. Like you said, I mean, not just Jackie, but you had writers. You had Pat Durkin back in the day that was the editor for Deer and Deer Hunting. You had so many people that came through the doors that, you know, as I guided there, that we met, that were very influential people that really spread the word about Bluff Country Outfitters and, you know, the region and stuff like that, and the hunting opportunity. And it just, you know, expanded from there, you know. So, but, you know, we're already getting down the road a little too far. You should tell people about how you actually ended up on that farm, because I remember that night when we sat there in your, you know, house in town in Strom, and we were like, okay, you know, let's start this outfitting thing together. You know, you were going to start it, I was just going to help. But, you know, we're faced with a big major question. We don't have a farm to do the outfitting on. You know, minor setback, you know. We're going to go play professional golf. We didn't have any golf clubs. But anyways, you're like, we got to get a farm.
So this actually farm came up for sale, and I saw the auction bill and went down and looked at it. And I had been hunting in the area, and so had Pat, and his dad actually had hunted this farm.
Yeah, it was our relatives.
It was their relatives, and it came up for an auction, and I thought, this is the ideal place for this. And at the time, we'd been hunting in Buffalo County for several years, and leasing was taking off, and we were losing farms. We were some of the first bow hunters in Buffalo County, and as everybody started leasing land, we were losing a lot of farms every year to leasing. So I know one year we lost 8 farms that we used to hunt, and in the beginning we could hunt any place. Nobody really cared. We could talk to farmers that have at it. They didn't understand bow hunting, I don't think, and they said, we can't get them with a shotgun. How can you get them with a bow and arrow, you know? So anyway, but at that time when that farm came up for sale, I ended up buying it at the auction, and scrimped and saved and borrowed whatever we could do to get the farm.
Yeah, I remember when you bought that farm, everybody's mouth was hanging open like, he paid that much for that farm. And of course, now it's a song,
Yeah.
you could
The
sell it
next
for
year, the
5 times
banker
the
told me, he says, you stole it. So it was just seeing the potential of it, I guess, and what it could be. And when we started out there, we only had a few tree stands, and some of the first year hunts we did were, I'd say, well, take a guy over to this stand. Well, I wouldn't sit there. That's not a good spot. And he goes, yeah, but we don't have any other place to put them.
Yeah, we only had so many tree stands, so we were really in a juggling act there. Yeah, it was.
Anyway, we got through those first years, and it just parlayed from there. And it was a lot of camp camaraderie. People from the beginning years, I still have people coming there 18 to 20 years later, and some of them come 3-4 times a year in the summer just to come and staying out because they got to be friends over the years, and it's just, and then when you took off, you met so many guys there, and the opportunities for your business just parlayed.
Yeah, I just met the right people at the right times. I'll never forget. When Tom, he bought the farm, and we were getting things up and rolling, and I'm like, okay, got the farm now, and we got to
better tell this.
But
I came home, I had this vision. I'm going to tear down all these old buildings and use the old wood and make this real rustic looking. And I came home, and they're all on fire. And Pat got there ahead of me, and he was burning down buildings he didn't think we needed. So,
no, I already knew Tom well enough that I know that he's a pack rat and he will save everything. So I was just helping clean up the place and take a lot less work off of me if I had a match. So yeah, I got rid of most of. He come in, he's like, "What are you doing? You're burning half the county down." I said, "Well, I'm just helping clean up this joint." But yeah, he got a few of the fires put out and saved a few of those buildings, which later then turned into pretty neat buildings that he refurbished and became the first bunkhouses. Yeah. Even the chicken coop became one of the first bunkhouses that the couples would get to stay in. And yeah, it's, if you've ever been to Bluff Country Outfitters, you would all know what I'm talking about. Tom's very, his vision, it's not like you're going to be staying in this, new sheetrocked building. It's all authentic and rustic and antlers everywhere that you look. I mean, there's a deer horn hanging, and it's just really a cool camp atmosphere. That's just, I guess, is part of the reason why, so many people just come back year after year after year. They just love the whole atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, when I drove into that farm too in the valley up there, I thought I could just picture it because it was like an old couple living back there at the time, and all these apple orchards and the valley, the way it's set in, there were springs and the creeks, and it was just a perfect setting for just a wonderful hunting camp. Actually, the first year I was there, you were working at Buck's Taxidermy in Wabasha. And
I was doing taxidermy.
Yeah, and the guy came, I think Buck called me and said, I got a couple of guys from Florida that want to go hunting and wondered if I could take them. I thought, well, I'll pay my taxes because we didn't have any money at the time. No. And it was, I'll pay the taxes. And so that's how it all started, kind of. We got
That's crazy. I never forget that first group. The Rawlingses from Florida. Yep. And I still am friends with those folks today. And, of course, actually hired one of them, one of their sons. He worked for me for an internship. Yeah, I see. You never know how things go. Yeah. And, I actually just seen Brooks the other day. I ran into him. Yeah. Wow. But, I met a lot of people and became friends with a lot of folks, Doc Pete and Doc Gary and everybody. Ole, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. But without that experience, I wouldn't be sitting here. I know I wouldn't. So I appreciate, that for sure. What were the challenges you think you faced outside of, we already mentioned that you didn't have much equipment. What are some of the other challenges that we face getting going in that, early days of outfitting?
One thing is we each had a pickup truck that you could take 2 guys with you in. And getting guys out, and we had no roads into the hills and stuff. So a big one was trying to get guys into their stands, which were located on top of the ridges or something, and that meant we had to walk them up there in the dark and come down and get another guy and walk him up in the dark. Or if we went to another property, we get 2 guys in our truck and go. And it kept us in shape.
I could probably use a little bit of that nowadays.
We don't do as much of that anymore once we got the roads and the stuff. But that was a big challenge, was getting guys out into good spots. And
we did have to, you were right, we had to leave early in the morning.
Yeah.
I mean, we had to get up extra early because you'd tell the guy, look, I got to walk you in, and I got to walk another guy in, so you're going to be sitting in the dark for a while before it gets daylight.
Yeah, and that's all. Of course, we didn't do very many guys at that time, and it worked out, but it did wear on us for sure.
Yep, it was fun. It was, and then from the aspect of just the stands and just the plethora of equipment that you didn't even have when we first started. And we didn't even have trail cameras back then or anything. I remember one of the first things that you ever got, I remember you getting a trail timer, and it was like the thread that, you pull out of one device and string across a trail over to the other device. And when something broke that thread, it would trip that clock. And we thought, man, we have hit the big time. Yeah. We got the edge now. Yeah, we're going to figure these big deer out.
How obsolete is that, though?
Right. That's crazy. And for many years, you produce your own trail cameras. And
we started building our digital one. Well, the crazy part was that we started running trail cameras with film, and 24 pictures or 12 or 24, and then we'd have to drive 25 miles to a 1-hour photo, get them developed, and it was probably all of a doe or just a branch blowing in front of it. Yeah. And it got to be an all-day job just to try to run trail cameras. So when digital one came out, that was such a big breakthrough. But we ended up building our own first because there wasn't many on the market. And of course, when we started this whole thing, there really wasn't a lot out there on deer and hunting deer, and magazines or anything weren't real prevalent at that time. So we had to learn about deer ourselves, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I learned from the hunters that were there, because you could do setups, and you always had, if you had 10 or 12 hunters in the woods during the rut on any given day, you got to know what was going on in that many spots. So you learned at such a faster rate, because it wasn't just you hunting and seeing one spot at a time, we learned at a faster rate of what was going on, and it just took off from there. And we're still learning.
Well, you have definitely mastered it. And like you said, you had over this many years, you have so many people out there that become your eyes and ears, to tell you what's going on, how things are going, and, what the deer are doing on a day-to-day basis, that it didn't take you long to fine-tune and learn your niche and figure out, this is where I need to be at this particular time. And we'll talk about that here coming up, is how you learn to pattern these deer and be one step ahead of them instead of one step behind them. So I think that's really ultimately, help your success with all your clients, is you know where to be putting these guys in a particular time of the year. Yeah. So that's a great point, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. How much land did you actually start with back in the day versus what you got now?
The farm when I bought it was, I think it was 311 acres. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, that was years back, and everybody was coming in and leasing. So the leases that I've had over the years, the ones I have to this day, at one time I had leased another farm, not in Buffalo County, but south along the river, and there was years they had earn a buck, and it put a lot of pressure on us because everybody that came to hunt had to shoot a doe first. Well, the number of hunters that we had come through, if we'd have shot every doe off, and then we wouldn't have had any deer.
You did shoot a lot of does.
Yeah, we shot 24 one year.
24 does.
Yeah, and
just to get those guys buck tags.
Yeah.
Wow.
So anyway, those as far as I leased farms in around the area fairly close to me, and everything else was getting leased up. So I still have the same leases I had 25 years ago. So I didn't lease a farm that somebody was hunting that, took a farm away from somebody else. Basically, I was, have the same farms I've always had, and like being one of the first ones in there. I've had farms that got sold over the years, and lost farms to leasing. But
do you think you have to have a big farm to grow big deer and shoot big deer?
Well, it depends on what your neighbors do too. I mean, the number of hunters definitely is a thing. If you're going to grow big deer, I mean, I did hunts over the years with different, like a lot of first-time hunters and a lot of women hunters, and they never shot a deer, and to get them into hunting and stuff. I looked at it like, if you have certain deer, there isn't always big deer on every farm, and there isn't always a potential deer probably there, but there's certain deer that you can see over the years. You watch and follow from year to year, and you can see how they develop. If your neighbors are doing QDM too and stuff, then that sure helps, because the deer aren't getting shot. The deer that they follow, if you follow them from year what they do in a year's time, how they change from month to month, and on summer feed, and then going into the fall and breaking up from their bachelor groups, becoming loners, and then they an older deer, 3 or 4 year old deer, is totally different lifestyle than a young deer. Like a year and a half or 2.5.
Right.
They do all the running and stuff, and the big boys just lay up and don't move much. And when they're vulnerable is when they're moving, and they only do that certain times of the year. So the specific dates of hunting and weather patterns, sometimes it varies probably every 2 weeks during hunting season that they're in a whole different pattern than they are. So that's why you have to change with them,
Well, and you're the master. You have learned that just by having that resource available with all those hunters in the woods at certain times, and you've learned these deer's habits in probably, in my opinion, one of the toughest places to hunt in the entire world. I always say, because I live, right across the river here, same type of country. I always say the Bluff Country in this hilly region that we live in is one of the very toughest places to kill a mature buck. And the reason being, it's just the topography makes it tough. And these deer know how to survive and elude danger and predators using the terrain to their advantage. I mean, they got the winds in their advantage most of the time. They bed with it, to where they can smell you coming. And if they can't smell you coming, they're going to see you coming, because it just,
And you saying that, it's very important, because you've hunted all over the world in every place there is. So tough.
It's a very tough place to hunt. That's why I always say, people are like, well, how come I don't see more hunts from, Minnesota and Wisconsin? It's just because it's a tough place to hunt. There's huge bucks. We're going to talk about Buffalo County next, because Buffalo County became, over the years, and I think a lot of it's due to, what you've done over there, is become one of the number one counties in the world for Pope and Young bucks and Boone and Crockett deer. I think it's number one in Pope and Young, and I think it's number 2 maybe in Boone and Crockett. Don't quote me on that. I'm sure I'll get some comments, but anyways, it's one of the leading counties, and it has been for quite some time now. Of course, there's a lot of hunters, but the deer density numbers are high because there's just that much habitat to support it. And I always say, there's food abundance everywhere. If you're in the middle of the hillside, there's still abundance of food. And I'm talking white acorns and browse and stuff. But if you go to the top of the ridge, that's a field up there, and that's generally full of either corn, soybeans, or alfalfa, high protein alfalfa. And then at the bottom of the the hills, there's also food.
And I'll add something to that too. Since I've been in Buffalo County 30 years ago, the habitat there's changed a lot, and the reason being is, that was all settled by, Scandinavians and Germans and stuff came in there and settled small farms.
Yeah, they're all farmers back then.
All farmers, and they all had cows, and they had, pasture, and over the years, all the small farms have gone out, and all that land's been bought up basically by QDM guys that are trying to grow big deer, and it's all old apple orchards, and all of them on the properties have probably, I would say, 80% or more of the land in the last 25 years has been sold for that reason. But they've gone in and put in, ponds and watering holes and food plots everywhere, and the
and
woods itself,
let those pastures grow.
The pastures grew up, so the habitat there has gotten so much more habitat and so much more remote, basically, or thicker. And they've planted hundreds of thousands of trees. I don't know. We planted 100,000 ourselves. So it's
right.
Over the years, and I've noticed that the animals there. I mean, the deer. It's just that much more cover for them. But there's been a lot of bears that moved in there. We never used to see bears there. There's a lot of bobcats. Ton of coyotes, all as predators have moved in there too.
So it's you would say it's helped the wildlife populations, by increasing the habitat and managing it. Wouldn't you say that they're healthier than they've ever been?
Yeah, I feel that they are. Yeah.
That just serves our point about how hunters, put back in the resource and are good for not just harvesting animals, but for overall wildlife in general. Habitat, it just putting back into it. And I get, and I know you're the same way, get more out of just working on and improving my land, and putting more into it than taking back.
That's fun. That's the fun part about it.
Yeah, we just plant so many trees now and stuff like that, and just the things you've done over there. Like if you go to Tom's, and by the way, if you get over in Buffalo County, you need to go see Tom. I mean, he's always had an open door policy. Come and say hi and stuff like that. But you drive back in his valley, and it's so pristine, like he said. And he had that vision from the start. But you also notice that Tom is a waterfall expert. Any little stream that has a trickle, he's built a little waterfall. He just likes waterfalls. And I've fell victim to helping him build these waterfalls over the years. So we always heckle and give him a hard time because, if you're going to help Tom, you're going to at some point be in the mud up to your elbows with, trying to put rocks here or there to make the water flow over them just for the scenic value of it. But it's just, again, it's insanely beautiful, and it's manicured, food plotted. The deer, find a haven there as well. So, you get over to Tom's, look him up. Buffalo County, again, one of the best places in the world, and still is. If you had to kind of, pick a factor, what has made Buffalo County the renowned county in the world for whitetails? Has it been QDM, or has it been other things? Now, I can kind of help set this up by saying, when you first came into the scene over there and you were hunting there and how things were kind of setting up themselves, and this is when I first just started getting to know you, you had been out doing your own filming, home filming, and I think you had a VHS camera and back in the day, and back you could shine legally. So you were out filming all these deer mainly at night, with this light and stuff, and you were wanting to show people in your area, and specifically your neighbors, that these big deer exist, and if you let them get bigger, it's just going to keep producing and keep really going. And you produced a series of videos. I'll never forget these because this is kind of where Tom and I really came together. that first video you called Monarch Valley. It was, and it didn't start off Monarch Valley. You just kind of, I think it was called the Bucks of Buffalo.
Yeah.
And produced it just for locals. And I think that the popularity just locally, you were quick. You had to start making all these tapes for everybody and sending all these copies out. And then one thing led to another. In QDMA, or Quality Deer Management Association out of the South, called you and said, hey, we've seen this video. Would you rework it for our national organization because it fits exactly what we stand for?
Yeah, I got a call from Robert Manning at the time, was the chairman of the board for QDMA, and they were just starting out. And Rob Wagner and him had seen a copy of this tape, which was just my year of hunting and passing up a lot of deer and talking about them and reacting with them and grunting them in and doing different things. And I had so many hours of footage, I got it down to like an hour, and I gave it to the neighbors that hunted and were basically meat hunters and shot whatever. And a lot of the bucks in the tape that we had grunted in and had come in and were talking about were ones that they shot that year.
Yeah.
And then they showed it to their hunting buddies, and I ended up, I got 600 calls that guys wanted copies of that tape.
The old VHS
and it was
tapes.
crazy. It wasn't even meant to make a video. It was, and you were filming at the time. It was just when VHS cameras came out, and it wasn't even my camera. My brother-in-law gave me his and said, "Take it down there and film some of those bucks." And when I met Pat, he was filming with a 35 millimeter still camera. Hey, I'm not getting into that video stuff, he says. He was going to stay with his 35 millimeter. A lot of that changed.
Yeah, boy, I guess it did, right?
Yeah, I can remember you saying that, and I laughed. But anyway,
see what kind of path you led me down, Tom? Now we got these video cameras rolling all the time.
For sure.
Yeah, but those videos, the first one called Monarch Valley, then you had one called Legend Lane and Monster Alley, then was your third in the trilogy. And those videos today, people still talk about those videos. I'll run into somebody out in a different state, and they're like, man, I remember back in the day when I saw you on those videos Tom Indrebo produced, and I'm like, why? You don't
25 years ago.
Yeah, that I was a lot younger looking then. But
I
they still enjoy them.
Yeah, I still get calls on them, and it's like 25 years later, but people saw them years ago and they were kids, and now they're older hunters, and they said that got me going on it. But it was QDM that called me and they wanted to put a blurb in there from them, so they had me send copies to the 13 biologists that run the study programs at the different universities. James Kroll from Texas, Harry Jacobson from Mississippi, and David Gwynn from Clemson, and they went through the tape and kind of critiqued it as far as what I was saying in there. And some of the stuff they said, well, you can't say that. And I said, because it's not a proven fact. And I said, well, so I got around it by just saying, well, all this is not a proven fact. It's what I found to be true in 30 years of hunting. Right. So then they used the tape and sent out to all their members to join QDM. And they flew up here and shot a 3-minute blurb to put in there to tell about their organization and what they had just seen on it. And and we just did their 30th, this last year, we did their 30th anniversary of QDMA down in New Orleans. And we talked about, the old days and the history that we had there, and to see how that organization has really grown and what it stands for and stuff. And just to know that I was kind of a part of the early days, and especially you being more of a pivotal part than I was, and how you helped that along, especially with those 3 videos. If those videos are still, you can still get them, right? Well, I did have them put onto a
DVD.
Right? I put them all 3 on 1, and of course that was several years ago. I sold them out instantly, so I never really reprinted them. I should reprint them because I still get calls on them.
Yeah, that would be great if we could. Maybe I actually have, I think, the video series. I should start putting that out there digitally so somebody can watch it. That would be fun to just show people some of that stuff, because it was so, we followed a lot of life's stories about these particular deer, whether there were albinos in the area or just particular bucks in general. You know, it was fun to see that.
Nobody really followed individual deer like that from year to year. Where some of those albinos were like 9 or 10 years old in the wild, and being able to film them every year and follow them was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's one thing that I really learned about Tom back early on, is that he had such a passion to not just go out and harvest deer, but just the appreciation of, you know, following them, learning their habits and stuff like that. It was just, you know, he taught me so much in over the years about, you know, this is where you should set up, how you should set up on these deer. And we would, of course, have all these conversations. I remember so many nights where you would be sitting in your office with your yellow notepad making notes, and that was always his famous little notepad. He had to make his, you know, list and stuff, and pretty quick he is like, you know, his head was down on his chest and he was out cold because he'd been working, so been up since 4 o'clock and going hard. I'll never forget the time that you and I been, you know, guiding our butts off, and I remember we pulled in and we took some hunters over to Azaz, and we pulled in there and we parked there at the parking site, and we ran our hunters up, and then we met back in the truck, and we were sitting there talking, and the next thing you know, we're both both asleep, and we woke up and we looked at each other. We're like, man, we're tired. Yeah, oh, there was so many. That was so fun.
But good old days.
Speaking of Azaz, that was another story quick on Tom that he said one time. He said to me, he says, "Oh, he goes, I just hung a stand over in Azaz, and it's a dynamite spot." He said, "I'm gonna have you take a hunter over there." And I said, "Okay, you know, I've been on that hillside a lot." And he said, "You can't miss it." He said, "You just go up to there where there's a big oak there along the edge, and then you cut up there and you go up about 100 yards, and then you'll see another big oak, and then you kind of cut over to the right about 50 yards." And he said, it's right in there somewhere, so you can't miss it. I'm like, okay. So I should have known when he said that was going to be a bad deal. So I take this hunter in the next morning, and it was one of the mornings where it was pretty cold. And he's got all his stuff on, and we try to quietly go up and get in this hillside stand. It's, you know, basically on the edge of a bedding area, and we get up in there, and I'm not really trying to flash my light around too much, but I'm trying to identify this oak tree that Tom's been talking about. Well, I figure out where the first one was. So I get up there, and there's like 1,000 big oak trees, and I'm like, I don't know. You know what? This oak tree said take a right and go another 50 yards. Well, long story short, we ended up walking around there for the next hour looking for this tree stand that I could not find. And finally it got daylight, and we were pouring sweat. And finally we find the tree stand, and we'd tromped that whole hillside so much that I felt like we didn't have a chance. But I went back, and Tom goes, "Hey, do you have any problems finding it?" And I said, slightly, but I said, next time we're going to have to use some bright eyes or some tape.
Oh, yeah, you don't forget those things that go wrong. And if they can, they will, you know. Yeah, you learn that, but that was, I think, a key, too, though. Every year looking at the operation and making a list of where the weak points were and say, these are the first things we're going to take care of. And so by the time hunting season comes, you're all set up, and you've overcome things like that could go wrong that maybe would, you know. So.
I always had a plan to, you know, trim the shooting lanes, and Tom can tell you he would take and hide the chainsaw on me all the time.
Well, after he burned down the buildings, you could see why. But yeah, I remember once we had a really nice and a thick area where these bucks were coming through right along this steep edge, and we had a big stand in there, and Pat was going to do some filming in there. We get up there, and he was clear cutting the area. Gino was with us, and he had hunted in there, and he said, "Oh, just hold on, I'll head back and get the picnic table." He goes, so he put it out there. It looked like a park up there.
I wanted to make sure if I saw a deer, I could shoot and kill him. I always told Tom, I think that was part of his plan. I teased him. I'm like, I get what you're trying to do here. It's just you put the hunters in there, and they can see the deer, but they can't shoot them. It's like one of them catch and release programs. I'm like, that's your plan, because the shooting lanes were always like this, where it was just solid branches. And I want to, when I have a shooting lane, I always said it needs to be as big as so where you could drive a semi through it. And he never liked that, because he's very natural, just maybe bust a twig here or there and not disturb anything, because that's what bucks pay attention to.
And some of the hunters I got too, I know that they were moving around a lot in the stand. And I thought, well, I got to hide them as much as I can so the deer gets in here to them. So it was fun in those days. We had a good time.
Oh my gosh, you have guided. How many Pope and Young deer do you think you guided over the years?
Probably it's not as many as you've shot, but
I don't know,
maybe around 500 or so, maybe something like that.
Yeah, because we were just talking about that earlier. Like, how many has 500 Pope and Youngs for clients over the years? How many you think were Gross, Boone, and Crockett?
Oh, I would say probably 15 to 20, maybe somewhere in there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Remember when Monty shot the Boss?
Yeah.
That's one really kind of got us all fired up in the first place. Yeah. One of the first years we were doing any of the guiding, and Monty Nichols, who was your brother-in-law.
And you had filmed that buck about 2 months before that, when you were going home from the farm there. And saw him crossing. And
that was one of the biggest bucks in Buffalo County at the time.
Yeah.
At the time. 206 and change or something?
Netted that, yeah.
Netted 206. Wow. Yeah, I remember when that day. Yeah, I'll never forget it. When he shot that and you guys recovered it, and just the excitement level of that kind of deer, because it was something that you've been working so hard at finally achieving, getting a deer that caliber.
It was that buck was the first Boone and Crockett buck shot in Buffalo County with the archery.
Really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. Yeah. And think how many since then have been taken.
Yeah. A lot.
That just shows you how Buffalo County has transpired into what it is today. It's crazy. What other bucks stand out to you? If I had asked you, like, obviously, the Boss or Monty's buck stands out that we just talked about. Any other bucks that stand out that your hunters have taken or shot?
There's a lot of them. Yeah, I mean the one shot on Emmons there, that buck was it was 180 something, and that was like a 3-year deal on that buck that I'd seen him over a 3-year period, and just all of a sudden I had a hunter out when I went to pick him up, and he was just waiting for me along the road on the property there, and came to pick him up, and it was his last day of his hunt, and he goes, "You ain't gonna believe what just happened." And he says, I'm sitting here in the ditch, and all of a sudden I hear clip clop, and I turn my flashlight on. There's this Boone and Crockett buck going right down the center line in the road, and light went on. The last 2 years before that, across the valley in the morning, I'd glass and I'd see this buck chasing during the rut.
Yep.
And so that was his last day of the hunt. A new guy came in, and first morning, 7:30, I had him go up to the stand I had up in there, and he shot him about 7:30, and it's a 180 something. That was one.
That was a typical too, right? Yeah. Mainly typical.
Yeah.
And you just figured his pattern from, again, what your hunters had seen and what you'd seen.
It just kind of clicked back, past things that happen on those deer. And from year to year, a lot of those same things repeat themselves, and those bucks hang in certain areas at certain times of the year. You got to change with them as the hunting season progresses, and whatever they're doing at that time of the year, if they're locking down with does, or if they're out looking for a doe, running scrape lines, or, and lot of the big bucks. There was one that you were hunting that was quite a story too. The one that was over on Hoover's that time, and we'd put an old food plot in there, and that was kind of a crazy story too, because I took a guy over there to hunt, and had him sitting on his one little finger, and he was going to sit all day, and in the morning, some guys came in on a Nick's property right across from him, probably about 100 yards from him, pounding, building a stand in there. And he was trying to call me and couldn't get me because he didn't have any reception in where he was sitting in there to come and get him. And about noon they left. That, oh boy, they're fine now. So 1 o'clock they come back, start pounding again, and so he's sitting there all day listening to that. And about 3:30 they left, and 4 o'clock this Boone and Crockett buck stands up and walks right in front of him, and he shoots it. And that's on the cover of that book that I did with Pat Durkin.
Ain't that crazy?
Yeah.
That just goes to show you that, you know, you should never give up on something just because you have this thought process in your head. Well, that's messing everything up, and I'm just going to get down and leave because. And
that's a good point.
You know, I think a lot of people make that mistake. I personally have made it a million times. They're like, you know what? I think I'm going to get down and go over here, and I'm just get impatient. And next thing you know, my impatience costs me a deer because I'll just start down the tree or something, and I look out, and there goes the big one.
Yes, yeah.
So that's a great point.
The biggest one is probably Moses, that whole story. And of course, you did a whole show on that, and
you had to bring that up too, didn't you? I knew we weren't going to get through this podcast without mentioning Moses, because everybody asks me about Moses, which I think is one of the most famous deer that I never actually ended up getting.
We all thought you had him.
Yeah, this story is phenomenal. A lot of people know the story already, but those who don't know it, you know, you should give them a little quick rendition of how it, because we'll put in, those that are listening to the audio version, there's a video version, and you can see the video portion of this, and it'll have the cutaways in there.
Well, Moses showed up on the farm, and when he got to be 3 years old, he started to be pretty recognizable, and I think you found the sheds off him that year. Up by the pond, up on the north side there.
Yeah, he was decent. He wasn't giant
at the time,
but he had some stickers and stuff starting.
Well, when he got to be 4, then he started looking real good, and at 5 better, and at 6 better. But Pat started hunting him pretty intently because you had taken off on your career at the time, and you needed to shoot a nice buck like that, and so you spent quite a bit of time at it, and we had him coming in, but every time he did, it was when you weren't there. So I think that's figured out there for a while. And then the 6th year, when he was 6 years old, Pat says we got to move, and ended up putting a stand up this little draw just above the steep part where he kind of could approach it through the draw. So we went in the same way that we had always been going in. And sure enough, here he shows up in the afternoon, and Pat gets a good quartering shot at him, and it looked like a heart shot. I mean, we looked at it, we left him go overnight, and the shot looks beautiful. If you get a chance ever to watch the story of Moses, you better watch it, because it's incredible, because everybody thought that the deer was dead, and we ended up going the next day, never found the arrow. We ended up getting a dog and got on the trail. He went around the ridge down below and climbed straight up over the ridge and into a bowl, and found a little blood in a bed there. And then we found some back down across the valley low, and went through this big cornfield the next day. And
we spent weeks looking for this deer.
We looked for him for 2 weeks.
We were thinking he's dead.
Yeah. And a month later, come driving in the driveway, and he's chasing a doe right along the driveway.
Like a ghost.
Like a ghost. It was like, you got to be kidding me.
And it looked like nothing had ever happened
to him. And then I did get a picture that in September is when you would hit him, in November, I got a really beautiful picture of him on a scrape. You can see where the spot was on, where he had the head hit him.
That's the most infamous photo that still haunts me to this day, because it's a 12 ring spot. Like you can see where my arrow or my broadhead had entered. And again, it like, if you have nightmares about deer like I do, I mean, that's what I always have the nightmare about, you know.
Anyway, we learned more from that deer than I think any deer I've ever followed, really, you know.
That's crazy. Yeah.
Another one that
What happened? So what happened after that?
Yeah, well, he ended up getting shot. Well, it was the last day of the bow season, and that same year, he was 6 years old, and I had all the hunters out in the woods, and I walk out on the porch, and he's standing with a doe by my granary looking at me. So I get my camera and start filming him, and he chases doe, must have been coming in heat across the valley and went up on the ridge. And 2 days later, the second day of the gun season, Trevor was just toward evening and along my field on top, and Trevor Oleson was hunting up there, and he come out of the woods and come down along that edge, and he ended up shooting him with the rifle. And so Pat and I, we did kind of an autopsy on him, and Pat's arrow had entered in right behind the front shoulder, hit a rib, and it hit the rib just perfect, and glanced forward, broke the rib ahead of it, went through and hit the rib ahead of that, and never went in the cavity.
Just went up underneath his shoulder blade.
Yeah, and hit, and it goes to show that if you would have been off a half an inch either way, you would have got that deer.
Yeah, because the arrow would have glanced enough to go in. It
would have glanced in instead of...
and not like all the way. It's like, I always said it was like shooting... archers have known this because a lot of them have done this, where you shoot through the woods and you hit a branch and your arrow just goes way off into the outer space. It's the same when you hit a bone. That arrow is going to change its trajectory, and that deer had such big, heavy... He was so big-bodied that he had heavy ribs, and when that arrow hit perfectly dead center, it was enough to really change the trajectory of that, enough to where it glanced at the arrow off the ribs and went up under that shoulder cavity. But as that deer ran off that day, after I shot him, I was celebrating. I'm like, I got Moses. Yeah. And because the arrow had great penetration and it looked like it was stuffed right in there, you know, all the way up 3/4 of the way. And in actuality, it was up underneath his shoulder blade and into his neck region and not in the cavity.
Yeah, that's it. I learned a lot from that shot too, and where you hit a deer. As a lot of archery guys hit deer and think they're killing shots, and that's probably looked like the most perfect shot you could make on a deer.
I learned on that one. Yeah, you know, if you've watched my stuff since, that day taught me something, and it's happened to me one other time. Those quartering away shots are tricky, and you know, a lot of people say, "Oh, they're super deadly," and you know, but you're working angles, and when you start working angles, instead of perfectly broadside, there's deflection issues like we had on Moses, and we tend to always cheat a little bit to, you know, they always say shoot for that opposite leg, you know, to where that opposite leg is in position. That's where your aiming point will be on the front side. So you kind of line that up, and then that helps you determine the angle. But in video, people don't understand angles because the camera, you know, it's flat. So we always tend to hug it a little tighter to the shoulder to make it look like a better shot, when sometimes that angle might change so much that it might come out in its neck region, and you might only one lung them instead of double lung them. So I've learned to just be more patient after that time. If I would have been more patient that day and waited, he was not going anywhere. He just stopped feeding. Waited for him to just get a little more broadside, he would have been mine, and the rest would have been history. But I got buck fever and shot a lot of deer since then, and I just, you know, those quartering away shots can get you sometimes just because of those angles and the deflection issues.
That's a good point.
Really good point. And I always said, you know, you shoot them back in the guts, you generally always get a deer. It might take a day or two to get them, but you know, once you start playing it forward, you got shoulder blades and leg bones to contend with. And you're also working that lung angle where you might only catch part of that one lung or whatever. And it just becomes a whole trickier deal. So always staying back is generally the better rule of thumb, but it doesn't look good for video because people go, oh, I gut shot him. Yeah. They're like, you want them to say, oh, that's a sweet shot. Yeah. So, that's part of little of the learning curves that we've went through over the years. But
and I think a percentage of hunters that I've done too over the years, because there's a lot of hunters, most of the deer that have been shot have been hit high. And I think it's their angle out of tree stands. We don't hunt as much out of tree stands now as we used to because we do a lot of ground blinds, and those really seem to work good. And I know you've had experience with that too.
Yeah, we're going to talk about using more modern day blinds and hunting out of blinds here in just a second. But that's a good point because I think it's like elk hunters too. A lot of guys hit elk high, but if you hit an elk high, bye-bye. You ain't getting them because they're so strong. Yeah. And it's such big country and not easy to track in country that they're gone. You never finding them. They might die, but they ain't going to die soon, and they ain't going to die in close proximity. So the aspect of hitting an animal high, I see that a lot. You got to be able to kind of gauge that animal's body language to know if he's on alert, he's going to drop too. That not always your aiming point is where your arrow is going to hit. So if you got a deer that all of a sudden you voice grunt to a stop because you want to get him to stop before you take the shot, he's going to be alert. He's heard something, and all of a sudden now he has stopped. He's tensed up like, what was that? And your bow goes off. Guess what he does?
Drops. Yep.
First thing he does is he drops. Yep. Well, some deer are really good at dropping.
Drop a lot.
I mean, they can drop a whole body length before your arrow hits them. So knowing that, you have to hold low so your arrow hits where you want it to hit. And psychologically, that messes with a person because, you get a deer that's 20 yards and you voice grunt him, and now you're settling your pin at the bottom of his chest instead of right behind his shoulder where it's perfect. Yeah. It's sometimes, and then longer shots are even more important because by then, they, longer shots, they have more time to react.
I have quite a bit of video of that instance, and they do drop almost a whole body length in some of the shots, and so you can put the cursor right where they are, where they're shooting, and you see, see by the time the arrow gets there. Yeah.
But nowadays with the modern day bows, they're pretty fast, and the arrows and stuff like that. That does help that factor out. But again, you're hitting that no man's land. It's think about how many bucks over the years have got away that your hunters have hit.
A lot, yeah.
A lot of deer.
I just picture of one on I think it's on YouTube or it's online somewhere of a deer in that no man's land that must have been shot in Michigan with a shotgun, and it's a hole. You can see light right through the middle of the deer, and he's fine running around. I've seen a couple hit there that guys thought they had him and then never found him, and a couple months later gun scene shoot him, and it's healed over right on both sides,
Yeah, and we certainly don't want to give the opinion that archers are not proficient, and that's just part of archery hunting. It's part of hunting in general. There is going to be a percentage that are not recovered, but the good part is, archery hunting, if you do wound them, they have a better chance of recovering and nothing really ever happening to them because it generally doesn't break bones when you're archery hunting. It's just like a superficial flesh wound. So it's like cutting your finger. Yeah. Eventually quits bleeding, and they're fine, and it don't affect their life or the way they live their life in the future.
Like a cut, yeah.
Yeah, they're next year.
They're very resilient too.
I shot a buck in Illinois 2 years ago, and this buck came in, and he was chasing a doe, and I stopped him. He's a big-bodied animal. 6.5-year-old deer, and I had to stop him because he was just right on her tail and he was moving too fast, And I had to stop him. Well, when he stopped, he was not perfectly broadside for me. And I shot, and by the time he reacted to, because I had grunted him to stop, and I hit him in the shoulder. He took off, and I was like, oh, I knew it. It's like that, not getting him, no way. I mean, but I still followed up. I still blood trailed him, and eventually the arrow come out, and then we trailed him for a long ways, and he quit bleeding. And I thought, well, good part is, it ain't gonna kill him. So the next day I was in the same area hunting, not in the same stand, a ways about a mile away actually, and it was the very next morning, not even 24 hours later, I look up and here he comes. He wasn't even limping. You couldn't even tell that I hit that deer. Yeah. Like nothing had happened. You couldn't even really see the wound. If I didn't know that deer perfectly, I would have said, there's no way it can be that deer, because you could never tell he had ever been shot. Huh. So he had just recovered that fast. Yeah. And he was just out cruising, chasing, looking for does. He almost got another shot at him, but that's just the way it goes.
That's amazing how they are. I've saw a couple of times where guys hit deer and maybe, I don't know how, exactly, they never really know for sure where you hit them until you find them. But following them, and all of a sudden they're making scrapes, and it's like nothing ever happened.
I know it. Yeah, it's crazy. If I had to ask you, what is your favorite time of the year to hunt big deer, when would that be? What if you had to pick a particular season? And we're going to walk. Next thing we're going to do is walk through the seasons.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you, where your favorite hunting locations are and tactics for each time of season. But if I had to ask you, when's your favorite time to shoot a big deer?
Well, each time of the year, as the season progresses, has advantages and disadvantages. To shoot a buck, probably the chase phase is fun. It's hard to stop them then if they're on a doe. But I would say on a big buck, it would either be toward the tail end of the rut or late season.
Really?
Because a couple of factors. Once, if you, what you find when the rut gets into full swing, the doe coming in heat, they say like 80% of them are bred, around the second week, probably 10th through the 15th of November. So you think about that as these bucks are locked down with the doe. They're not moving very far. And you saw that hunting down over the hill there by Lamets that time when I think Gary Clancy was hunting down below, and you went over and you filmed 17 bucks that night or something was with that doe, where it just moved over the hill. Anyway, but if you think about it logically, there's does coming in all over at that time, in that time period. So each doe has a number of bucks building up on her and locked down with her. So the only times I've seen it hunting myself where I saw 7 bucks with a doe and go into a valley in the morning, sat over the hill from that, and they came over the hill in the afternoon, and there was actually 8 bucks with her. And so there's a lot of dead area in the woods at that time. And if I got a dozen hunters out there, invariably somebody's going to be where a doe comes in. But the rest of the guys are in dead areas. So there's pockets of all the bucks are over here or over here. When you get towards the end of the rut, most of the does are bred. Those bucks got to travel.
They're searching you
to find one. So the tail end of the rut is, I actually was able to catalog one that actually was a resident buck of my farm. That it was almost Thanksgiving. It was during the gun season, and there was really nobody gun hunting around there at that time. A guy called me and said, I shot a buck that you got on your website. And he brought it over, and it was a buck I had seen that afternoon at 4 o'clock in front of my house, a buck I knew very well. He had an eye poked out and a sticker off the base. And he shot it the next day at 3 o'clock, 6 miles as a crow flies across the Buffalo River over by a Cyberling farm that he had bought some from them, and brought the deer over there. and that deer, the only reason that deer would not go that far, but
because he look at all the habitat he walked over past
feed
deer.
Everywhere.
Yeah, look at where he went to.
The only reason he went, he couldn't find the doe, years ago, it kind of got me into deer hunting. I read an old book. It was Roger Rothar wrote this book, and last year I thought I haven't seen that book for 30 years. I want to read it again and see. And he says in there the same thing, that those deer will travel toward the tail end of the rut. They might travel 6 to 8 miles in the night and then return back to their home area, but looking for a doe, and then they'll lay up again, because the post rut is over, so they'll lay up till the winter feed. The other thing is late season. I'd say there that the main factor there is cold weather. If it's warm, if it's in the 20s or even 15 degrees or something, that's too warm. It's got to be. It seems like 10 degrees and colder. It's got to be the high. If it's below zero, each day is better, and it's a food thing then. The rut's over, but there's a small percentage of the young does that come into heat, the fawns for that year, and they're in those family groups on the winter feed. So those bucks are coming from a distance, the big ones that show up there. I know of several 200-inch bucks shot on the 13th of December on a food situation where they come in to feed where the family groups are feeding, and a young doe, Paul Borwick shot that one you were.
Yeah. The main thing is you just got to beat all the other deer senses and stuff to get to the big ones, because they come last.
That's right, and that's the tough part about that. And the cold weather's got to be in your favor. But that's a deal where the big bucks are coming to you versus you trying to go to them during the rut when they're picking up a doe on every ridge,
Right. I think it's probably one of my favorite times of the year to hunt deer here in the Bluffs, Buffalo County or Minnesota is that late season period, because they are back on a food pattern. I like that. Nicole both her and I have shot a lot of late season, probably more late season deer than anything else, because for big deer, because they are, again, they're back on a pattern. It's interesting to know, for me, there's a couple times a year to really kill a big deer, in this country, and that's early season and late season because of food. Anything else, they become too unpredictable once, girls become involved, and, messes up their whole pattern. And it's not just here. If I go to Canada where, in Saskatchewan, you can bait, and those bucks, pre-rut, they're putting on the feed bag. They might be on your bait site, daily, and all of a sudden when the rut starts to come in and they start searching, they can be not 30 miles, but they can be 3-4 miles in a different direction and not coming in every day anymore. So they're not regular. And once that irregularity starts, they can get killed by, some other hunters or wolves or, cars
not
or whatever.
Patternable then.
Everything comes into play, and, it's just a lot tougher. And then you mentioned the aspect of when they lock down. Everybody, that's a deer hunter is, probably already experienced the lockdown problems, but personally, so that's, we worry about that because our scheduling is so important to wherever we go and however we plan our hunts. We don't want to go to a part of the country that might be in lockdown because you're just going to be sitting there seeing a bunch of immature deer running around looking, but all the big ones that you really want to shoot, they're all hemmed up in little draws and little areas where they're locked down with that hot doe, and they ain't moving. They ain't moving unless you are right there. You're not going to get them. So
that's an advantage that I didn't realize in this outfitting, that if you got 10 or 12 guys out there at that time, invariably you're going to find one coming in. So you got 12 chances versus one person hunting or two people hunting.
Do you move your hunters?
The hunters are increasing your odds 12 times. So if you find a doe coming in with all the bucks locking on her, I usually move all my hunters into that area because they're not going to move very far from there. They may go over the hill or go here. But we've shot a lot of bucks that way, good bucks, you know.
Yeah, you move in on them.
Move in on them, yeah.
Because, you know, they are going to be there. I mean, well, you taught me a long time ago, one of your favorite places to, when they get into that lockdown phase or that real heavy chase phase, is out on the end of these ridges. And on the end of these points where it's thick, and that's where a doe goes to try to lose that
Straight
buck.
up and down areas, yeah.
Yeah, just chase, and they chase around, but he can't really get her because they can pop over the lip of that little end of that ridge and all of a sudden out of sight, and then the buck is trying to figure, then he has to scent trailer, and she can throw him for a loop and eventually maybe get away from him. So Tom taught me a long time ago, when we get into that phase or into that time period, and we talked a little bit about making those adjustments, is we would start putting guys in those point areas, in those thick, real steep areas, because that's where you were going to shoot your biggest bucks.
And that can be midday at that time.
Right.
End of October, right? The peak chase, end of October, 1st of November, when they're really pushing those does, and they'll end up killing them sometimes if one buck just takes over where another one left off, and they run them to death. They get so tired they lay down, they just horn them to get them up. And
you remember that? Yeah. Do you remember that video that we had on one of the TV shows where Nicole and I were sitting on that water hole in Wisconsin or in Buffalo, and that buck chases that doe down into that? Well, there was a couple bucks, and they chased that doe down into that water hole, and she'd been run so hard, and she'd actually been gored in the stomach, and she was dehydrated, and she got into that pond up to here, up to her chest, and she was just drinking but yet trying to stay away from them, and they're chasing her around in that water, and the only place she could keep them away is in the middle of the water. Yeah. And then they chased her out of that water, and she dove into the thickest brush pile that was next to this pond and just laid down, and that buck got this big 10-pointer. He was so aggressive, he got right into that water after he chased all the bucks away, and then he got into that brush pile where she was hiding and gored her out of there with his horns, just so she would get up to eventually so he could chase her down and breed her. Yeah. It was the craziest sequence of events I'd ever seen.
Yeah, over the years, I've seen several where they actually run them right off of a shale pit one time, run the doe wide open, right, and ended up killing her. She fell the whole distance down there, but ran her right off the end of that. It was like, it's weird, when they get to that point, but it's short-lived. It builds the end of October, but once it's over, then they give that doe, when she's going to stand, they all back off and kind of give her room at that time for almost a day, where they just follow her like a shadow, but they don't push her.
Right.
So, and that's usually when the big boy shows up, and the younger bucks, if they try to get in on them, they know that big one will kill them if he gets at them, and he tries to run them off if they get close to her. So they just stand there and look at her, and if she moves, they follow her, but they don't dare get close to her. If one does and he chases it off, then the other one will try to slip in there.
Is there any favorite particular spots that we just talked about on the end of these points and ridges and the steep stuff? Is there any other spots that you would hang your setups or put your hunters on when it's in that time frame?
Ponds or watering holes, because those bucks they're not interested in eating it all at that time. They're just interested in chasing, so they run off a lot of weight. But they get dehydrated because they're running so much. They're steady running, so they invariably go to those ponds when they come by them, and the ponds are always hot at that time.
Well, that's great information, Tom. We're running a little long, so we're going to make this a 2-part series. So that does it for part 1. We'll be back with more information from Tom on part 2.